Hello, my name is David Adès, and you can't see me because I'm having problems with my Zoom today, so you're just going to have to hear my voice instead. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of this monthly poetry podcast reading series called Poets Corner, in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see a sharing and a closeness of spirit. It's badly needed in these times. Each month, I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Willo Drummond, who will be reading poems from her recent collection, Moon Wrasse, which I've got in my hands and which I would love to show you, but can't. There you go. And talking with me on the theme of process, provenance, and influence. But first, an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. Willo is recording from, I'm not sure where exactly, but somewhere near the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. You can tell me in a minute, Willo. I'd like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging of the Wallamita people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and of the Darug and Gundungurra peoples, the traditional owners of the land from which Willo is recording, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Willo Drummond is a Sydney poet and sessional lecturer in creative writing, whose critically acclaimed debut collection, Moon Wrasse, published by Puncher and Wattmann in 2023, was shortlisted for the Kenneth Slessor Prize for Poetry in the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards and commended in the Five Islands Poetry Prize for a first book of poetry. In 2024, Moon Wrasse was selected as one of 6 Australian poetry titles to feature in the annual Aesop Queer Library. Willo has been the recipient of a career development grant for poetry from the Australia Council for the Arts, shortlisted for the Val Vallis Award, the ACU Prize for Poetry and the South Coast Writers' Centre Poetry Award, runner-up in the Tom Collins Poetry Prize, and longlisted for the Liquid Amber Poetry Prize and the Grieve Writing Awards. Her work has been anthologized in Best of Australian Poems, 100 Poets, Australian Poetry Anthology, The Writing Mind, the Incompleteness Book, and elsewhere. Willo's doctoral research into creative writing and literary influence was awarded a Vice-Chancellor's Commendation for Academic Excellence and included a volume of poetry in dialogue with the work of Denise Levertov and with Levertov's personal index to the selected letters of Rainer Maria Rilke. In 2023-2024, Willo co-edited with poet Stuart Barnes, Queering Ecopoetics, a queer-themed issue of Plumwood Mountain, an Australian and international journal of ecopoetry and ecopoetics. Hi, Willo, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
I'm sorry you can't see me, but it's probably
okay.
a good thing. You've chosen as your theme process, provenance, and influence, which are elements of poetic practice that fascinate me because I've found that every poet's approach is different. What was in your mind, Willo, when you came up with this theme?
So I was, well, thank you for having me here today to talk about this topic, which equally fascinates me, so much so that I did a research thesis on it. What kind of, well, I was always kind of generally interested in this area, but what kind of focused my attention on it was that I became conscious that certain lines from Denise Levertov in particular would arise kind of unbidden in my mind, sometimes when I was writing what seemed quite unrelated poems. So there's some poems in this collection which deals with a kind of range of themes, from coming to terms with being a childless woman to gender transition from the perspective of a loved one or family member, a range of transformations. But some of these topics are not necessarily themes that Levertov would have been writing about, yet something about some of her language seemed somehow embedded or significant to my creative process in some way, or I became conscious that it had a particular presence. And so that's kind of what kind of focused my attention on that theme. And I started kind of looking into it further as part of my PhD research. And we're probably going to get more into this later, but as part of that kind of looking more closely, I actually stumbled across the fact that she had made this quite detailed index personal index to her copy of the selected letters of Rainer Maria Rilke, to kind of contain and catalogue 78 passages from his letters that were significant to her. So she's written about the fact that she considers Rilke to have been a mentor for her. So I had this personal interest in, what she did, how is she significant to my creative process? And then I came across this fascinating artifact that kind of revealed the extent to which he had been important to her, perhaps in a similar way. So that's how my interest in the area kind of deepened, and a research thesis and a creative project was born of that.
I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about Levertov and Rilke as we go along, but just a couple of general questions to start off with. Do you conceive of process, provenance, and influence as separate elements, or do you find them all interwoven?
Great question. Let me think about that. They're all interwoven. They're all interwoven. And the reason that I say that is because our relationship as writers, our relationship to our influences or texts that we read is very much part of creative cognition. So what were the labels you were using? Process, provenance, and influence. So yeah. Influence, I came to see, looking into this stuff with Rilke and Levertov and using some theory called extended mind from philosophy of mind. Influence is not just a kind of passive thing that happens to a writer. It's actually something that a writer actively seeks as part of the creative process. And there's lots of things I can say about that, but it's significant to the moment of writing, and it's significant to who we become as writers over time as well. So they are all intertwined, is my answer to that.
Yeah,
excellent
okay.
question.
How conscious are you of process, provenance, and influence when you sit down to write a poem? Are these elements of writing in the foreground when you write, or are they things that come into play more later?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. And it's interesting in terms of my preparing for today, in fact, and going back to the provenance of some of the poems that we might be reading. I was reminded of the degree to which so much of this is subconscious. So when I say it's something we actively pursue, it's not that we sit down and go, or it's not that all of our influences are consciously in the foreground of our mind at all times. It is much more subconscious than that. But I was just really lucky to be able to trace via the transgenerational and intertextual relationship between these two writers, and then looking at some writing that I did in response to their dialogue as well. I was able to kind of trace it and make some of that dynamic visible. And then the poems that I've written, that I wrote for that project that ended up in here, which wasn't all of them, they were very interested in making that kind of that subterranean work or the roots of influence visible. So it's got to have a lot of footnotes, a lot of notes.
Yeah, we'll come to that in a minute.
Yeah, which have been commented on. And I have to say, these are a minute percentage of the notes that were in
I'm sure.
the original versions of them. So, yeah.
Just backtracking a little bit, I'm always interested in how poetry finds a poet, or how a poet finds poetry within themselves. What drew you to poetry in the first place? When did you start writing it? And what influenced you to become a poet? And I guess also I'm intrigued by what led you to Levertov.
So I came to poetry kind of after some other artistic lives and phases of life. I came to it quite late as a postgraduate student. I had previously been a songwriter, and before that I was trained as an actor. So I had been immersed in language in these other ways. But for whatever reasons, maybe class, maybe gender, just my life path, I did not see myself originally as a writer. I saw myself as in these other kind of artistic domains. And it took a really long time for me to give myself permission to even my the path to becoming a songwriter was a slow process, because I had to find a way to give myself permission to even, put those words on the page. So singing was something that was there before songwriting was for me. And then writing poetry isn't something I found permission or a way to for myself until I went back to study to do some postgraduate study in creative writing. This was after having a job for the literature board. Just kind of by chance, I fell into this role, and I ended up managing the individual writers' grants there. So I was in this really privileged position for a few years of being privy to the projects that were going on in Australian literature. I'd hear a lot about people's process, and that was simultaneously inspiring, but also somehow gave me this little chink of kind of permission that sent me back to study writing. And that's where that path began for me. And that's also where I encountered Levertov. And that's actually significant. So in terms of this whole influence thing, because she's a really foundational poet for me, because of that I came to her early in my poetry life, which started late for me because I came to writing later. But I think that's significant. And it's similar to when she came to Rilke. She came to Rilke quite young. She was a writer from a much younger age than I was. But yeah, I consider her to be a formative influence for me, because she was someone that was significant for me that I came to quite early. Originally, it was her ideas on form that I consciously understood were important to me. And I later learned that there was other stuff going on as well in terms of her significance.
I'm really interested, actually. I think you're the first other poet I've met who's talked about permission in this way. And it interests me because that's my story too. I didn't want to call myself a poet or consider myself a poet, because if I did and then I failed, I'd lose the dream. So I started very late for that reason. That I actually had to spend decades to give myself permission to actually write and get on with it. So it's interesting to find that in someone else.
I think also sometimes there's part of becoming a poet is a degree of life that needs to be lived first. So there's that angle on it as well. Yeah.
You'll be reading today from this exquisite book, Moon Wrasse, which you published in 2023. I note from the acknowledgements that some of the poems date back to 2013. So there was quite a gestation period for the book. Can you say something about the genesis of this book, and in general terms about the role of process, provenance, and influence in shaping the book and making it the book it ultimately became?
Thank you for asking that question, because it was a really slow to birth book. Yeah, there's poems in, there's actually the very first poem that I had published is in this book. That's probably the one you were noticing, that was 2013 or something. The poem was published in Cordite. Yeah, so there's kind of probably three, well, there's 10 years of work in the book, but in these kind of three phases. So there's some early work in Ecopoetics that I was doing around the kind of 2013-14 era. Then there's some work that came out of the PhD that I did thinking about influence, which I kind of finished in about 2019. And then there's some material in the book that came after that, when I was kind of going through what ended up being kind of the final couple of phases of grappling with my identity as, or the reality that I was going to be a childless woman, living my life as a childless woman, kind of coming to a particular age and going, okay, this is the end of this now. This is the end of this, what was itself a 10-year journey. So there's the three phases, but there's also the fact that when I came out of the PhD, which had a significant creative project attached to it, it was a creative writing PhD, I could have gone ahead and published what I had. I had enough material for a book. The point of doing the PhD was partly to end up with a publishable manuscript. But the poems that were born of that project were of a really distinct, very, very dense intertextual nature, and very specific, very much about engaging with this particular dialogue between Levertov and Rilke and myself. I've published quite a few of them in journals and things, but they weren't of the character that I envisaged my first book for a general poetry audience to be. So some of that material ended up in here, but not all of it. And the material that did, from that project, that did end up in here, I actually spent quite a few years reworking the volume of notes as well, so the poems and the notes. And that development was largely part of a mentorship that I was lucky enough to have with Felicity Plunkett. So when it kind of came to pass that was something that was going to be able to happen, that mentorship, that's what I wanted to work on with her. How do I get this material into a shape that I think will be more appropriate in the kind of book that I envisage, and that will work with the other material that will be in the book with it. So that's why it took a long time. I guess it would have already been a long time if it came out at the end of 2019, but there was another 4 years on top of that where further development happened, both in the shape of the collection and in the shape of the poems themselves.
I mean, there is process involved in writing an individual poem and another process in putting together a collection of work. I wanted to know, is process a fluid, changeable thing for you? Do you find that you need a particular process for your poetry to work best?
It's quite fluid, even though I spend a fair bit of time thinking about it and writing about it in the scholarly part of my life. But when it's happening, it's quite fluid. And in fact, I have to be careful that I don't overburden it with directives. I have a very strong inner rebel that doesn't like to be told what to do, even by myself. And in fact, that was an issue that I had to overcome in developing some of the material in the Levertov Rilke poems. There's a sequence of them in the book that are born specifically of trying to track very closely these constellations and pathways from the letters through Levertov's journals to appearances of verbatim bits of material and these particular concepts that she kind of integrated into herself from all of that reading and journaling into her own poetry across her whole career. So there's I think there's 3 of them in the book, but there was originally 7 of these poems that closely track that conversation, engage with that conversation. And I had a whole kind of plan about how I was going to do that. And as soon as that kind of got locked in, it didn't work. It didn't work anymore. I found that I had to approach the material in a much more diffuse way for the process to be creatively generative. I find that's the case in all genres that I'm writing in. So if I'm writing something in prose as well, like an essay or something, I have to approach things quite obliquely. That's partly a permission thing, and then it's partly a rebel thing. Yeah, but there's something about kind of approaching things with a kind of diffusion of focus that seems to be key to creative generativity. Certainly for me. I know that there are other writers who are planners. I'm a planner in other senses, but to any degree to which I plan a writing project, it really needs to be thrown out the window in order for the process to be generative. I need to feel that it's very fluid and organic, I guess, and I need to do everything I can to get my conscious mind out of the way. Yeah, I have to really be operating from, I guess, a more subconscious level. Of course, there's other things that, you write in other ways, but I find the best things come from those times where I'm able to kind of park the conscious mind and park whatever rules and directives I've set up for myself.
Is influence a random, ad hoc, unplanned aspect of writing poetry because you find yourself, for example, responding to something you have read, or do you more consciously gravitate towards certain voices, certain possible sources of influence because you think they might resonate with you more?
It's ad hoc in the first instance, certainly for me. And I also think that like I'm not loyal. I'm not loyal. I'm just constantly casting around for it, it doesn't even need to be poetry either. It could be, I've got a scientific book down here on mangroves that was very creatively generative for me. So constantly casting around. Sometimes I read anthologies of poetry, looking for a kind of vein of feeling, tapping into a particularly kind of strong feeling, tapping into something that will kind of crack me open. So that is ad hoc. But I think then once we identify sources that have that effect on us, we tend to go back and back and back to them. And certainly Levertov did do that.
Yeah. One last question before we get on to some poems, because we got to do that sooner or later. In every poetry collection, there are choices of what to leave in and what to leave out of the collection. You've already sort of spoken about that a little bit. You've included 9 pages of detailed notes at the end of the book that speak to the provenance and influences that shape the book. And this is something we don't see much in poetry books these days. Can you tell us why it was important for you to include so much detail in the notes?
Part of it's because I'm, paranoid, an honest person, and they were very intertextual. So a lot of the material needed to be cited. I know not all poets take that position these days, but there was never any alternative for me on an ethical level to not cite any verbatim usages. But then I also have included in the notes allusions and things like that, because specifically with this project, it was so much about, you know, making the roots evident or engaging with this particular literary dialogue that was going on. I felt like the notes, you know, people don't have to read them, but they are there if people want insight into the provenance, into the background conversation that these poems are being born of. Like, I just find that stuff infinitely interesting, and I would always want it to be there. So I included it for that reason as well. You mentioned at the beginning of this question the issue of what
to leave in
goes in and what goes out with the collection. And that was probably one of the biggest learnings for me with this, pulling this collection together. You know, it's my debut, so it was the first time that I'd encountered this process, was the significance of everything that you leave out. And I suppose that's the same as with a poem, right? Everything that you leave out, it's what you leave out that is almost the most important, because then it makes the shape emerge, makes the shape shine through. So I found that totally a really powerful process, and really fascinating too.
Shall we have a poem?
Okay. I might just have a little sip of water. So I might read The Way There. This poem, probably a really good one to start with, because it's kind of touching on the significance of reading to the creative process. Roll up your sleeves, wrestle in the dust of the common world, walk daily among birds and multitudes, taste wild mint and fruits, sit a while on an old stone bench of conch and limestone, listen with your eyes at the turn of a chalk-lined creek where the reader gets splashed with clear water.
Now, this poem appears at the end of a section inspired by Denise Levertov. You mentioned her a bit already, but I wanted to ask you in particular how she has influenced your work generally and how that manifests in this particular poem.
Yeah, so I think I touched on before that I was conscious early on that her ideas on organic form were significant to me. So for anyone that reads the book, you'll see some lineation choices that I make in several of the poems are maybe of interesting, maybe of interest. And that kind of arises from her ideas that form is a revelation of content, and that the form of the poem, which I take particularly to mean the line ends and the concrete placement of things on the page, should create for the reader the experience that the poem is seeking to convey. So I think of the form of a poem, even a free verse or organic form poem, as a really kind of material experience, a really material encounter. And I want the placement of the lines on the page and my line ends to do things to a reader, to create a certain energetic experience for them. So she was originally, and I was conscious of that, important in that regard. This poem has a little bit of that going on. There's a few kind of intense kind of line breaks or strong enjambments in this poem. And these ideas at the beginning, roll up your sleeves, wrestle in the dust of the common world, they actually come from an essay that was written on her, some of those ideas, that she was really interested in the quotidian, in wrestling in the dust of the common world. Yeah, and there's a few other ideas kind of alluded to or embedded in there that are from some of her poetry. I was also lucky enough to visit, oh, mind blank, Ilford, where she grew up as part of the research for this project. And so I kind of had a lived experience of some of the things that she refers to in her poetry. So there's a bit of that going on in here as well. But primarily this idea that the way to the poem, the way to the task of the poet is via reading and maybe some situated experience as well. But reading, the significance of reading is the primary theme there.
You have a poem called Note to Self that you'll be reading later, but this poem too seems to be a note to self, a kind of call to action, to rolling up your sleeves, to paying attention.
Yeah.
Would it be too much to say that this is kind of like a personal manifesto about both how to live your life and how to tend to your poetry?
Yes. Oh, I love that. I love that. Yes, is the answer. And just to continue the obsession of bringing everything back to Levertov, it was for her too. So something that, or a primary thing that she got from Rilke, kind of beyond any matters of craft or technique, were ideas about how to live, how to be a poet in the world. She has an essay called The Poet in the World. A certain stance to the world, ideas about what constituted the task of the poet. So for her, and I would say for me as well, there's particular ideas about ways of being that are both kind of an ethics for life, I suppose, but also some instructions or they are also about being a poet in the world. They're about, you know, how to find your way to a poem, how to serve poetry, how to serve a poem. Yeah, I love the way that you framed that.
Thank you. And you've really, I guess you've sort of already talked about this. The line "wrestle in the dust of the common world." The notes at the end of the book talk about the origin of that, but I'm interested in what this line means to you particularly. Is it about labor, getting your hands dirty, or is it about the need to engage with the world bodily, physically, or is it about the work of poetry? What is it all about?
I think it's all of those things. I think we write from our experience in the world, and you need to live. You know, the day-to-day, sometimes the intensity of experience in order to write. And I also don't think that that is that separate from reading, because I'd say that lived experience gets tapped into or evoked or called up when we read, and when we read and write, or read for the purpose of writing. And then what was the third part of your question? Or the third option?
Is it about labor, getting your hands dirty? Is it about the need to engage with the world bodily, physically, or is it about the work of poetry?
Yeah, and then the work of poetry is, to me, it is almost, it's working with your hands, right? It's a craft. You are shaping something that's quite physical and material. So I find it very bodily. I know that I kind of sense that a poem is ready when my body is responding to its body in some way, when it's kind of come to its full form. I spoke about line ends before. They're really important to me because of that bodily nature of the poem, the bodily experience as the reader. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it tactile for you, Willo? Do you write by hand or do you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I always draft by hand first,
Okay.
and only once I'm several drafts in do things go on the computer. The computer then has its own, working Word or whatever, has its own expedience and use, because you can play with line ends quickly. But poems always start in handwriting for me, in the journal, multiple different drafts. I probably go to the computer a little bit earlier than I used to, because I trust my process a bit more now, because I'm a bit more experienced, but things still always start handwriting on the page. It's a really material process for me. And I sometimes physically, when I've gone to the computer, or even just from the journal, I work with cut-ups and things. So I think my poetry reads quite lyric, but the process is often quite maybe experimental, surrealist. There's cut-ups, things. Sometimes I'm placing things all around on the floor. And again, that's a tactile, material experience, engaging with the language in this really physical way. The end is not for a poem that looks, or the end goal is not for a poem that retains that experimental origin, but it's certainly there in the process a lot of the time for me. It's tactile, it's physical, it's material.
Ordinarily, we would say, look with your eyes and listen with your ears. But you've got this line here, and I'm interested to know what you're trying to convey in the line, listen with your eyes.
So that actually comes from Levertov, from a Levertov poem, and it's an illusion. But it's also, and there's traces of Rilke in there as well, but it's this idea that as the poet listens, so he sees, that, I'm kind of paraphrasing Levertov there, that we as poets are learning to see. And that's kind of why the poem is called The Way There as well, that via that kind of reading, writing process, that listening with our eyes, we're learning how to see.
You finish the poem with the lines, where the reader gets splashed with clear water. To me, this end could mean, hey, reader, wake up from your reverie. Or it could mean, I want to shock you into alertness with this poem. Or it could just be a playful message from poet to reader saying, read me, enjoy my words. Or it could be something else altogether. What was your intention with those lines?
I love all of those interpretations. They're all great. I suppose the clear water is some kind of insight, some kind of truth.
Clarity.
Yeah, that via the reading process is delivered perhaps as a surprise to the reader. That was my intention there, but I loved every option that you offered.
Don't you love how, one line can have so many?
Yeah.
It's great. Would you like to read another poem?
Okay. Oh, I think this links beautifully to what we were just talking about, because this poem is called The Act of Making. And it's written after a line from Louise Gluck's love poem, and also kind of a background resonance from The Wild Iris. There is always something to be made of pain, she said. The claret scarf, a souffle, misshapen gardens fecund with memory and fluffed intentions. How can you bear so many imagined blooms, heavy with scent of hope, let go? You tend tender shoots day after day, while remembrance scratches your knuckles, and solitary bees hover, uncertain what to make of such circuitous traversing of stiff, dry earth. Unwomanly, bent queen, brimful of shame, with nowhere to dig in. You strike scrape flushed clay seeking signs, portents, why the seasons unfolded as they did, why the iris falls blue as the moon, why cicadas go on singing when song hushed long ago in your throat. No one can say. Parched, you shake barren dust from boots, walk on and on to build another bed, simply for the act of making. Somewhere, a ghost orchid blooms.
So this is the opening poem of the first section of your book, titled The Art of Losing, a term you acknowledge as having been conceived by Elizabeth Bishop. For me, it's conceptually interesting to consider losing as an art. Can you say something about what you understand by this term and what it means to you?
Well, in the reference comes from her poem called One Art, which is a villanelle and basically a list of losses across her life, from the small, from keys, and it increasingly gets more significant and personal. Houses, a country, and eventually her lover. So that's the origin of the idea, and that's the illusion with that reference. This section in the book, this is a hard-hitting question, David, thank you, is most of the poems in this section of the book are concerned with disenfranchised grief, particularly, and there's all kinds of these. So there's environmental grief, you know, that we're not allowed to be too sad about the loss of the world around us. One of the primary ones it is concerned with, the poems in this section are concerned with, and the book broader, in a broader sense, is the grief of childlessness, particularly but when it's due to, you know, not by choice. So either by circumstance or infertility or even ambivalence, or a blend of all of the above. But in our culture, it remains a taboo, even though, and I don't have the stats with me today, but it's either 20 or 25% of cisgender women in Australia will be childless at the end of their childbearing years. So it's a percentage of the population, that will live their lives this way is greater than we would think. Yet there's still no space accorded to discourse around this, to expression of grief. There's an assumption that, you know, you should just kind of get on with things, not talk about it, or that if you know, if you haven't sorted it out, you know, it must have been a choice. Or there's quite a few poems in the book that come out of my coming to speech on that issue, and this is one of those poems. Because grief is a social emotion, and it can't be transformed and healed if it's not given space to be dialogued kind of interpersonally with others. So yeah, this poem is the first of a few in this book that specifically speak of that experience. And just to go back to that permission idea that we were talking about before, Louise Gluck is a particular source of permission for me, or was key to me coming to voice on this particular topic. And she's kind of remained this kind of powerful space of permission for me since this poem, actually. Something about her willingness to speak of darkness. She's so stark to, you know, to use stark language, to speak plainly. Something about that is utterly invigorating and galvanizing for me, and is like a shot in the arm of permission, which is what happened with this poem. I was just doing a little improvisation, a spin-off kind of, that term spin-off is from Levertov, from that there is always something to be made of pain line. And really much of this poem came quite quickly. It involved shaping later, but many of the ideas in it were there in that early draft. It kind of just powerfully came out of me because of this permission to speak and not hold back from darkness.
The poem's subject is introduced early with the reference to pain in the first lines. There is haunting pain and loss and grief, but on my reading, there isn't a sense of the narrator being stuck in those places so much as caring for them and tending to them, as evidenced in the words, "You tend to shoot day after day." This seems to me to almost be holy work. Is that one of the things this poem is trying to convey?
I love that. And I think of poetry that way in general. Feels strong to say it about one of my own poems.
Why not?
I do think that that is the work that poetry does. And the poem is, you know, drawing that parallel between the work of poetry and between grief work. So the tending, yes, is that daily work in that sense. Yeah.
I mean, it's clear on reading these poems that there's very deliberate word choices throughout them. And, you know, "You tend to shoots," to me, it's like a signpost for the poem.
That's great. I mean, yeah, I love that. In a kind of literal sense, or the image that I was dancing across there, you know, is of being in a garden. I actually don't have a very green thumb, so I think I got a bit attached to that idea for a while I was struggling with the fertility stuff.
It works metaphorically too,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So the trying and trying again for a garden that does not come to pass. The grappling with memory, because when you're dealing with infertility, or even ambivalence, or any engagement with thinking deeply about fertility for a long time, you know, it becomes very layered. And so there's strata of griefs with the various events that processes that you've been through, or phases of decision, or you know, failed treatments, things like that. So you're grappling with that burden of memory as well, as part of the grief process. And again, I wanted it to have, I'm interested in the materiality of the poem as a main thing. So I liked the physicality of the tending of the garden as well, with that kind of ironic kind of symbolism of the failed garden. And I think I felt like, you know, to go back to that permission thing, like Gluck gave me permission to write about, just on a surface level here, a bad garden that never comes to fruit. And the bleakness of that, and the scratching in the earth of that, and the shame, but continuing to persist, tend, nevertheless, because the process is important or significant or needed or necessary, even if it doesn't look like what one imagines a garden would look like.
It's natural when bad things happen to us for us to say, why me? As the poem does in your exquisite lines. Why the seasons unfolded as they did, why the iris falls blue as the moon, why cicadas go on singing when song hushed long ago in your throat. How, talking about sort of what we put in and what we leave out, how did you settle on these particular lines from all the possible ways you might have expressed this idea? Did you write other alternative lines here that you discarded for these ones?
No, I think I wrote those lines, but they only were able to stay in once I found the way to lineate them. Again, that's a permission thing. When I saw that I had basically written why on the page, I was a bit shocked and didn't know if I was going to give myself that much permission to say why.
I'm glad you did.
In a poem. Thank you, Louise Cook. But when I figured out how to do it and to just make it a visual reference like that at the end of the lines, I found the permission to leave them in. And the iris falls blue as the moon kind of was an echo that came forth from the Wild Iris, Louise Cook's poem. So that was one of those kind of unbidden images that came forth. I live in the Blue Mountains. You asked that before, so mid-mountains. So we have strong cicada seasons.
I'll bet.
Here, kind of deafening. I can't remember if we were in one while I was writing the poem, but they are so intense that one doesn't forget them, even when you're in an off season. And that's a sign of fertility as well. That's their whole mating process. So those images did just kind of cluster together as I was writing, but then I had to find a way to decide whether I could allow why to stay.
And you did.
Yeah, I did.
Well, some people could spend a lifetime looking for answers to such questions, but this poem continues with 4 simple but extraordinarily powerful words no one can say, before the narrator picks herself up to walk on to resume the act of making. Is the act of making then restorative, returning someone in grief to themselves or to the life they still have to live?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, I feel like I don't want to kind of crush too many of these images with literal meanings, but no one can say kind of alludes to kind of unexplained infertility as well, and the frustration of that phrase. Yes, but absolutely. Any poetry in particular, but any creative process is essential for healing. Certainly for me, it was essential to my processing of this particular journey, but always in life, and even before I was working as a poet, art, whether it's performing on stage or music, has always been a way for me to understand, to come to understanding of the world around me. So it's very much about that, the necessity of looking to the practice, continuing the practice. to move toward healing and growth and understanding.
Would you like to read another poem for us?
Okay.
I've never had a poet say no when I've asked that question.
Yeah. Okay. So this one that I'm going to read now is called The Levadero. And it was written originally, the original draft was written in the States when I was lucky enough to be in the archives at Green Library at Stanford, reading the Levertov papers. And it might be worth mentioning that on the page facing this poem is a quote from Levertov that says, "When words penetrate deep into us, they change the chemistry of the soul, of the imagination." So this is called the Levadero, and a Levadero is a government official appointed on the island of Madeira to maintain and regulate the irrigation systems that run all over the island, that channel the water that is captured by the trees overnight. It's a very kind of rainy, misty area. Captured by the trees, it goes down into these channels, and the Levadero is responsible for the management of this captured water to all the farms everywhere. And of Madeira, where mountain firs comb water from clouds after dusk, the Levadero cools warming tempers of farmers in drought. Across the Atlantic, on a coast by the Pacific, I cycle round a place of learning in the lap of another mountain, sail an avenue of palms, traverse El Camino Real. Here morning fog masks silicon, dairy-free yogurt, politesse and privilege, and TV news breaks trill of empty pool parties to save a dry Cal state. Under vaulted windows, light rains down on the pages of an adoptee citizen who walked with placards here, who saw the redwood bloom. I drink songs of quiet deputies, sift bones of poems and dreams. When evening comes, sleep rolls in like a blanket stitched with 1,000 precious needles to comb this life from the day. The kind of also at Berkeley at one stage. So she when she moved to the States, she eventually worked at a few universities in that area. She went on protests and things in that area. And I was struck while I was in the States, the kind of cognitive dissonance that can occur simply by being in America. It's this kind of place of services, this place of, I was at Stanford, so this immense wealth, and then there's very visible poverty on the streets. The pool parties thing was a real thing that was on the news or on an ad or something that I saw while I was there. There was a drought going on. You're there in this big kind of Silicon Valley, this big seat of capitalism, largely responsible, capitalism, largely responsible for what's happening to the environment at the moment. And I was struck by the kind of, I don't know, the dry pool party seemed quite bizarre to me. Let's engage in some excess to save the environment, but, with an empty pool. So there was just all of these kind of contradictions around me all the time. And then the depth of what I was doing, swimming with these letters and journal entries in the day in this magnificent place where the light literally rains down. And I saw a parallel with the kind of the rain from the doco I was watching about Madeira. So there was this strange tension between what seemed like something, the depth of what I was doing in the day, and then the kind of simulacra side of things, of just being in the States and the very strange loud ads on TV at night. So there's a schism between the parts of my life in that moment. Yeah, and it kind of just all came together in the range of kind of contradictions that end up in this poem.
Yeah, and I'll just running on from that, the title of the poem and its beginning is in a specific location, the island of Madeira. But then after 5 lines, the poem moves to a rather less specific and unnamed location, across the Atlantic. That emerges as being in California, where, as far as I can gather, the rest of the poem is situated.
Yeah.
The link between these 2 locations is drought. And I suppose part of the cognitive dissonance is this sort of strange juxtaposition of these 2 otherwise unrelated locations in the poem. Is that one of the things you're trying to do with that?
Yeah, so all these moments of serendipity happen all the time, right, when you're a writer, but they're no less miraculous. So in amongst all of these strange loud ads and the news about the pool parties, this quite interesting documentary comes on. Yeah, and that, and reminds me of our interconnectedness, this tiny island where they're experiencing drought, and then, the way that's affecting the location I'm in. And being Australian, I'm also very sensitive to thinking about issues of drought, and knowing that Levertov had been politically active in that area, and how long do we need to keep fighting for things, and not much is getting done on the issue of climate. Yeah, and the levadero, the person who has that role in Madeira, is also, just because they are a person who ends up going to all of the properties and all of the farms around the place, they end up being a kind of messenger for the community. So I was struck by that idea as well, levadero as a messenger, poem as a message, messages I was engaging with or receiving through being in the archives. So it all kind of connected for me. The very first bit of the poem that came was just that final last little sleep rolls in like a blanket stitched with 1,000 precious needles to comb this life from the day. A version of that kind of came to me, and I quickly jotted it down in my notes app as I went to bed the night after seeing some of the documentary. And then the rest of it kind of grew while I was there. And then actually I returned to it the following year to add in, where is it? I sing songs of quiet deputies, sift bones of poems and dreams. That line actually came to me on this really creatively generative walk that I, while I was doing my PhD, I was living in this area of Sydney that is near a waterbird refuge. And as kind of part of my daily practice, I would walk around this waterbird refuge every day on my break or on my lunch break or in the morning or whatever. And I'll probably talk about this a little bit more later, but on this particular day, I read this passage from Rilke's novel, I've got it here, The Notebooks of Malta Lawrence Brigger. And it just unleashed this really creatively generative space for me that was so potent that I was jotting lines down all along this walk. And it didn't even, I was actually walking with my partner, so I'm usually a really solitary writer. But on this day, that didn't matter. Nothing could get in the way of all of these images coming, and I was jotting them down in my phone. They ended up being a poem that I think we're going to read later today, but one pair of images from that day was this I drink songs of quiet deputies, sift bones of poems and dreams. So when that line was born, I placed it in this poem, and it kind of moved more toward completion. The quiet deputies idea is comes from an idea from Rilke, or a passage that Levertov had indexed of Rilke's, in which basically he's talking about the externalization that happens in the drafting process. He talks about these two pens. You need to fashion a second pen. So there's like the pen that, you know, you write to your friends with, or that writes these impressionistic things from your life, or maybe, you know, works through your feelings or something. And then there's this other pen that you need to fashion in your mind, that you kind of are workmanlike and hard with, that you kind of work a poem with, to the point that it becomes so externalized from you that all you can do is stand facing it. And I'm kind of mangling the quote here, kind of facing it and marveling at it as some kind of quiet deputy. So this idea that the poet is in service to the poem, and that the drafting process is a process that the poem becomes this fully formed thing that is separate from you, that is so external from you, that you are kind of standing there, deputized to it, facing it in wonder. So that is what that quiet deputies idea is about. And it's also about observing that process in the archive, you know, sitting there with the words of Levertov, who, you know, if we think of all poets as quiet deputies, that's our function, that we are these quiet deputies to poems, and that across the generations, poets have been these quiet deputies in dialogue with one another, with poems. So I was conscious of this tradition, or this history of these quiet deputies, Rilke, Levertov, other people that were mentioned in Levertov's papers, and then myself doing that work in the archive, and then the idea of taking that stance eventually at the end of the process of drafting. There's a lot going on in that quiet deputies idea. Yes. But it was born in this kind of really amazing moment after this, on this amazing walk that I went on.
You mentioned the final lines of the poem that came first. Sleep rolls in like a blanket, stitched with 1,000 precious needles to comb this life from the day. And those lines speak back to the opening lines, where mountain firs comb water from clouds after dusk. It's not circularity, really. It's not repetition so much as variation and echo. The poem bookended by imaginative combs. What are you trying to convey to readers by this echoing?
Well, I think when I think about how to best close a poem, I think you need to arrive at some kind of sense of you know, return, but transformation, right? So I like an idea to be transformed by the end of a poem. I am trying to echo the combing of the sky that the fir trees are doing. And I think, you know, my mind was just alive every night with all the stuff that I'd been reading in the archive. I was also had to work really fast because it's a huge archive, and I was only there for 2 weeks. And the staff in the archive were actually really generous to me and gave me kind of more voluminous and quicker access to some of the materials, because they knew I had to cram a lot in while I was there. So, you know, in the night while I was sleeping, there was all of this processing going on, both of what I was reading in the archive, Levertov's life, because I wasn't just looking at drafts, looking at her notebooks and letters and things, and then the life that I was living while I was there, with all of its cognitive dissonance, but with some of its amazing things as well. So I was, you know, there was a bicycle that the Airbnb I was staying in provided me. So it was kind of very romantic, like I was having this romantic film of my imagine dream life, cycling around Stanford to the archive each day. It was so I was having a heightened experience of life and engaging with someone else's traces of someone else's heightened experience of life as well. So the combing in that sense is a transformation of that original idea, but also that idea of the processing that the mind is doing at night, I guess.
Mm. You've mentioned that poems are always in conversation with other poems and poets with other poets through their poems, and that you've sort of come into this conversation between Levertov and Rilke as a sort of third party, if you like. What conversations are you looking to have through your poems with the poems of, say, Levertov?
I think it feels a bit prescriptive, so I don't think I'm consciously... So maybe when I was talking about Gluck before, I have a bit of a sense of the type of conversation that I have with Gluck, because it seems very attached to a particular type of poem. With Levertov, it's a bit more diffuse. And I also think that once I started to do this work, I was more engaged with the hybrid Levertov-Rilke voice. Perhaps originally it was more Levertov for me, but then it became very much this this hybrid. Actually, that hybrid idea is something that Kevin Brophy, who I know you've had on the show, talks about. That the writer is hybrid. They're kind of monstrous in that way. So I was very much pursuing a dialogue with that hybrid consciousness that is Rilkean, Levertovian thinking in this project. But, my relationship with Levertov is not over, or with Levertov's Rilke is not over. But I don't think, if anything, I would say it ends up being about the task of the poet, about ways of being and perceiving the world, which Rilke is just so good at talking about. And that was a primary focus of the material that Levertov was engaged with from Rilke's letters. Different people get different things from Rilke, but that was what she was engaged with. Yeah, but that's interesting. I don't think I have a sense that I'm only just, I'm only becoming aware of that distinction as we speak now. But I might have a sense of that with, what seems to happen with, say, someone like Gluck, whereas perhaps it's broader with Levertov. I don't have a specific sense of, I'm going to write this type of poem, so I'll go and read Levertov and that will get me there. I don't really have
more
that.
organic, more organic.
Yeah.
Okay. Another poem?
Oh, okay. Let me see. Okay. I'm very tangled up. So I might read two poems now from the sequence that is called the Rilke Index. So I've touched on that a little bit as we've been speaking, but I might just say a little bit more about it. So the Rilke Index is a personal catalogue that Levertov created in the flyleaf of her personal copy of the selected letters of Rainer Maria Rilke, particularly the whole translation, in which she identified 78 passages of interest under 51 quite poetic labels, some of which are taken verbatim from Rilke's prose. And just, to evidence that, there are things like Autumn the Creator, Standing at Windows, How Can We Exist, As Ready for Joy as for Pain, Further Than Work, Our Conflicts Are Part of Our Riches, Open Secret. So you can hear that they're gorgeous, right? They are so poetic in themselves. They're so evocative in themselves. And in fact, the labels themselves kind of served as heuristics or shortcuts because they're so rich for her, it seems to me, to, you know, the deeper, broader meaning that was in these passages. She returned to them. So she made this index in about 1947, and then she returned to this indexed material, rewriting it, retranscribing it in her notebooks at several intervals over the years. And then many of the passages that were indexed originally in this personal catalogue found their way into a dedicated commonplace book that she made from the 50s to the mid-60s, in which she catalogued all of what she called these brief essential texts, essential to her poetics and understanding of the task of the poet. It's this gorgeous little, quite small but thick hardcover green notebook that was, you know, like her, this might be a bit sacrilegious to say this because she was actually ultimately a religious person, but to me it seemed like a kind of Bible, her kind of Bible to her poetics. So I'm going to read a couple of poems that directly engage with this indexed material. So I'm going to read one that's called Autumn the Creator, which is the very first entry indexed, and another called Open Secret, which is a synthesis of two, which I'll talk about in a minute. So these poems, and I spoke about this process a little bit before, the intention of these was to engage with these constellations of material that were the indexed bits of prose themselves, evidence of that material as it re-emerged in Levertov's writing down the track, and then, you know, my entering that dialogue a little bit as well. So this first one is after index item 1. It's called Autumn the Creator. True singing is a whispering, Rilke wrote, on autumn winds, perfection pressed, more creative than even-toned spring. It hums along the avenue of original grief, polished as a stone, and each of us particulate, borrowed, stolen, given, found, who write long letters every evening for the chance of breathing, ride the amber highways of a song-piling sky. And this one's called Open Secret, which is a synthesis of index item 13 and 13.5. Safe in a womb of twig held by branches, the pell-top sings her inwardness, her decorated temple laid bare, a secret that she makes no distinction between her heart and the world. Perhaps one day you will let yourself approach the mountain, raise yourself to silvery peaks, witness her song. For there is only one kind of desire that takes this work further, the will to begin, to be, to defy, to advance step by step toward a kind of living sure of itself, like a bird note gently caught at the very edge of things.
I have more questions than we could probably have time to deal with these poems, but we'll see how we go. Just starting with Autumn the Creator, insofar as it references lines and phrases from both Rilke and Levertov, and your poem explicitly refers to borrowed, stolen, given, found, do you regard this poem as a found poem?
Yeah, you can definitely see the index poems, and actually originally there were 7 of them, there's only 3 in the book, as a variant of found poetry, or some of them you could even say there's one that's very much at the end of the spectrum that you'd call a cento. So because they are so intertextual, you could you could say that, you could frame them in that way. There's of course also my voice in amongst there as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but definitely in that terrain. Yeah.
You mentioned how you had the 2 weeks at Stanford and there's a volume of stuff to get through. And I'm interested in that, in the sense of process and provenance, the amount of sifting and reading and rereading of Rilke and Levertov that you had to do to write these poems. What was the germ of the idea or the ignition that shaped this suite of poems into being?
It was this suite that actually was the seed for my whole thesis. This suite, this idea that I could map this index and play amongst that constellation of material just got me really creatively excited. And I went, great, I've got my creative project. Now I can proceed with this broader area of research. This has legs as a project. It's a really tight scope, which are all these kind of things you have to think about when you're designing a scholarly project. So when I came across, because I'd originally been reading a lot of psychology of creativity, reading a lot in that space, and I was maybe going to head in some direction like that. And then I had that, question about what's happening with, I wrote the title poem of the collection, Moon Wrasse, and it had a line of Levertov's in it, which seemed very strange to me because the topic of that poem is gender transition. I was like, what's Levertov doing there? That doesn't make sense to me. So that I started reading about Levertov, and then I came across 2 articles by a scholar called Edward Slakowski, who had known Levertov personally, and he mentioned this index, and my creative mind just was a light, and I thought that was the coolest thing that I'd ever heard, and I knew what I was going to do. So even though it took me a long time to learn or figure out what I needed to do to write them in a way I was satisfied with, the concept of writing them was the seed of the whole Levertov-Rilke project for me. It's kind of strange maybe that only 3 of these specific index poems made it into the book, but that's what was needed for the book. Yeah. Was there more to that? Did I miss a bit of that question?
No, I said, what was the germ of the idea or the ignition that shaped this suite of poems into being? I think you've addressed.
So I literally, you mentioned being in the archives, and actually going back through my drafts for today, I was reminded that I wrote the original drafts for many of these index poems before I went to the archives, because it was a method of research for me. So I was using the process of developing them, via my kind of lateral creative mind, to prepare for the kind of things I wanted to be looking for in the archives. So I think I had a consciousness that I wanted to do that before I went. And then they were, enriched and solidified after I had been there. But the drafts for most of the index poems were written before I went overseas. And I've actually got images in my like in my files of the drafts of them stuck on my wall, and they would kind of accrue, would draw, new elements would be drawn to them over time as I kind of came across more traces of a particular index entry in Levertov's work, or here or there. So it was kind of a very kind of sedimentary process. So it was kind of fun to come across those images the other day when I was reconnecting with all of this and going, oh, my draft wall. Yeah. So it was, again, a really material process.
Well, that answer really segues beautifully into my next question, because, I talked about what, shaped this suite of poems into being. And I use the word shape because it seems to me that by incorporating words taken from Rilke and Levertov, you are fashioning some kind of composite poetic sculpture. Is that an apt way to describe your poems in this sequence, do you think?
Yes, I love that. I always want a poem to be a sculpture. I think of it as a kind of sculpture of sound. I thought of these when I was writing them. You know, I called them originally I was thinking of them as the constellation poems. So that's how I thought of them as, you know, that I was tracking and tracing these constellations of material, of thought. Yeah, and then there was the physical side of that as well. And then, you know, they're very much, just looking at them now, you know, there's evidence of kind of an organic form kind of approach if you look at them on the page. So they are Levertovian in that sense as well. They're in dialogue with her beliefs on form as well.
I mean, you talked about this volume of material you had to go through. How did you go about choosing the lines and phrases from Rilke and Levertov that appear in your poems from their sizable bodies of work? I mean, is it because those lines and phrases particularly resonated with you, or did one line or phrase lead you to another?
Oh, both. They led me to one another, but it was very much what adhered to me. So I guess I was like the medium. And if things sparked in me or stuck to me, they made it into the draft at least. So again, it was that I had to really drop a rational approach to it, even though the seed of it was this kind of very mechanical idea of, oh, I'm going to trace, you know, all of this material across these texts. I had to drop any kind of conscious or mechanical approach other than these broad sweeps of this index entry, that index entry, as these kind of broad containers. And of course, there's a lot of cross-pollination across each of the categories as well. So I really had to get the conscious mind out of the way in order for me to write poems that I felt stood as poems, not as a bit of scholarly collage, which is valid in its own sense, but I wanted to be writing kind of sensuous poems. You know, I'm primarily a lyric writer, so I wanted them to stand on their own as poems as much as I could, even though obviously they are still very intertextual, and, you know, maybe a bit strange, I don't know. But I had to find an organic, I guess, a process that was organic for me in engaging with the material that allowed me to write a poem in a way that felt like I was writing a poem. So yeah, it was a really diffuse, intuitive reading process that I guess then once I had these drafts in place, I then went to the archive and applied a more conscious, literal mind to the pursuit of things. But the identifying of what was important had to be intuitive, had to be via a process of drift. You know, borrowing that word from an amazing essay that I read by Rose Lucas there. Yeah, it had to be this kind of diffuse, lateral, drifty reading process. And I was just alert to what triggered things within me, what felt creatively generative or fertile. Yeah, it had to be an intuitive process.
I can imagine that if, you know, you're sifting through so much material, there would be lots of other lines and phrases that you thought of using, but ultimately rejected, or lots of sort of failed poems in this suite of poems. Is that right?
Yes, I think in terms of I think I've been in the original project, the index poems, most of them came to pass. But then I was also working in a similar way and writing other poems that weren't strictly these index ones. And, you know, a lot of them didn't come to pass. And then a lot of things that did make it into the thesis manuscript didn't make it into this book. And some I had to concede are, you know, serving a different purpose in the world. So I did publish the 7-poem sequence as a kind of scholarly experiment in text. They're out there if people want to look at it. But I decided that these 3 were the strongest as the kind of poem that I wanted to have in this book. So, yeah.
In the notes, you describe the poems in this sequence as a synthesis of response, citation, and allusion. I'm interested in that description because it suggests more than simply a response to Rilke and Levertov's work. Is part of your objective here to be a contemporary echo of their work or to connect contemporary poetry readers to it?
Definitely. I want there to be a sense of kind of 3 voices here. So, yeah, there's, or even more if you count the kind of hybrid versions of what constitutes a voice. So in formatting the poems, I tried as much as possible to make, you know, there's some things are in italics, some things are in quotation marks. I tried to make Levertov's voice, Rilke's voice distinct from my voice. Yeah, I definitely wanted it to be feel like a conversation, I guess. Yeah.
In Autumn the Creator, you wrote of true singing and the amber highways of a song. In Open Secret, the Peltops sings her inwardness, and then you imagine that one day you will let yourself witness her song. And the back cover of the book refers to your poems as poems that seek to sing the emergent self into being, and that are deeply engaged with the notion that we are shaped by the voices around us as well as those we carry within. Can you say something about the role of song and voice in your poetry?
Great question, David. There's a lot of things I could say about that. There's a few things going on there in that idea. My own origins as a songwriter constitute the way I think about poetry. I'm primarily a lyric poet, which, you know, people can frame lyric as musical. But that's an essential quality of lyric poetry. I think I'm also referring to in that idea the open secret idea, actually, which Levertov has taken from Rilke, but it's also from Goethe, which is this idea that the open secret is that which is the kind of divine mystery that lies everywhere in all beings, that which lies at the bottom of appearances. And this idea related to that all deep things are song. So that was a quote that I had on my wall. That only now that you've asking me this question do I see has made it in a kind of elusive way, like there's an illusion in these poems, even though I haven't quoted it in the ones that are in the book. I've possibly quoted it in the more extended sequence. I can't remember. Yeah, I think of a lyric poem as song. There's also in there the bird in the Open Secret poem comes from this idea from this 13 and 13.5 index entries where open secret and pollen, really significant images that show up again and again and again and again in Levertov's work. So they were really important to her. But it's this idea from Rilke that he was actually writing in response to a letter from Andreas Salome, his friend and lover and correspondent, about the open secret of nature. And he talks about the idea that the bird doesn't have a sense of itself as separate from nature as humans do, and this is an idea in ecopoetics that people talk about a lot, partly because it's, you know, it's never outside the womb of nature, and it talks about the nest as a womb. So that's why I talk about the nest in this poem, that it has this, you know, distinct way of remaining, of not separating itself from nature. So that's where the bird in the poem comes from, and the kind of poetry of the bird song as well. There's a lot woven together in these poems that it's even kind of difficult to talk about them in a way that kind of doesn't tangle things up too much. But that's what's going on, kind of a literal sense with song there, and then that's some of the background to my relationship to the significance of song in poetry generally and in these poems.
In Autumn the Creator, you have the line, "For the chance of breathing." And then in Open Secret are the lines, "For there is only one kind of desire that takes this work further, and then to advance step by step toward a kind of living sure of itself." Are these poems referring to the work of being, reaching for an authentic way to be in this world?
Yes, but more specifically, that the path to that for the writer is writing. So Rilke talks about in his kind of letter to a young poet, the idea of, you know, you'll know that you're a writer if there's a necessity to writing it, that you ask yourself, must I write? And so the write long letters every evening for the chance of breathing is this idea that there's a necessity to writing for the writer or the writing inclined person. That is absolutely essential to attaining what he called a saner state in the midst of our being. So that's what's going on there. And similarly, that takes this work further. That's another index label, actually. And the will to begin, to be, to defy is from a Levertov poem that deals with some of these ideas, the necessity of writing.
I mean, excuse me. You've mentioned the reference to nests and the poems referring to birds and seasons. And I know you've also mentioned sort of nature and ecopoetics. Is the natural world a touchstone for you?
Yeah. Yes. And I think you can't, I mean, I live in the Blue Mountains, so it's the natural world is extremely present for me.
Yes.
Every day. And you also you have to have a certain degree of humility and humbleness around it. So, and I've lived here for, you know, almost 20 years now. So, and even actually the period that I didn't live here for a little while, I lived in another area that, you know, as I said before, had a lot of bird life and things. So just by the stint of my lived situated experience, I am around a lot of non-human animals, plant life, you know, the vegetal world all the time. So it informs my ways of being, my ways of understanding the world. And then, you know, I have an ethical interest in ecopoetics as well. And I had actually, before I embarked on this particular research project, I'd done a master's looking at ecopoetics and lyric with a particularly Australian focus. So I was a bit of steeped in that theory and that thinking before I came to this project. So it definitely does. And there's also themes in the book that, you know, can be categorized, you know, themes of human experience in the book that, you know, can be categorized by people who are being ungenerous as, you know, more or less natural. So I'm interested in, you know, thinking that through as well. And I think that the natural world makes its way into my work a lot because I'm interested in speaking back to these ideas of what is natural, unnatural, what is natural, what is nature, etc.
Is it going so far as to say that to be of the world, you must be immersed in it?
Yes, you could say that. Yes, that's valid. Yes.
Okay, I just said that. Reading the line, perhaps one day you will let yourself approach the mountain, and the inference it contains that sometimes we have to give ourselves permission, there's that word again, to do things, somehow led me back to the lines that you've already talked about, sift bones of poems and dreams in the levadero, and then back to the line, somewhere a ghost orchid blooms in the act of making, and to the sense that yearning underpins your poetry. Have I drawn too long a bow? Is that a fair assessment?
No, that's definitely there. Even at the level of permission, you know, when writing isn't coming in the way you hope it to be, there's a yearning for writing. There's always a yearning for kind of what feels like an unmediated access to experience. Yeah, so, and that's in this poem in particular, that let yourself approach the mountain is referring to that, to maybe dropping, you know, those kind of human rational barriers that keep us disconnected from the natural world, the immediacy of the natural world, rationality, consciousness getting in our way, things like that, dropping that. But also there is, I'm conscious that this appears in my poetry all the time, this kind of meta level of yearning to be closer to poetry, yearning to be deeper in the process, yearning to get back to the moment of a poem being born or forming before you, you know, because so much of drafting is the groundwork that hopefully gets us back to that moment that the poem coheres, or that insight comes, or that you tap into the vein of feeling that the poem needs, and everything drops away, and you are at one with whatever the experience is that needs to come forth through the poem. And, you know, for whatever reasons of temperament, just the nature of being a human, anxiety, a range of a million kind of things conspire to get in the way of that process, of that sense of union. So yeah, I am conscious that that is often there at this kind of meta level in lots of my poems, this narrative about the act of writing poetry itself, the felt sense of that.
Shall we have another poem?
Yes, okay. Where were we up to?
I think sail.
Okay, thank you. In an instant, you were a sail, loosed, flapping, sprayed with a sea of tiny blades, a vast over-sensate skin. Your silent voice, a gaping mouth, calls from a crack in the world. Desolate wind, sweep my knowledge into oblivion, drop me back in the well. All that sounds the clink of flailing shackles against the mast. Experience says, in time, the canvas will snap taut. Right now, this sheet is the shape of living. The ladder's blown, the world's all wailing wind.
Don't know how other people read your poems, Willo, but the way I experience them is that on a first reading, they seem to be somewhat opaque, somewhat folded over on themselves. And then with every successive reading, there's an unfolding. until I finally approached some understanding of them. And this poem exemplifies that for me. So I'm going to try, here we go. We're going to do a collaborative process here. I'm going to try to interpret the poem, and you can tell me if I've got it right or if I've completely misunderstood it, right? So the opening of the poem, in an instant, signifies for me an instant of catastrophe, an instant of shock, where everything shifts as if an anchor has been severed. Have I got that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. How much should I say as part of this dialogue?
Oh, well, that's up to you.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, poem is kind of about what I call a grief storm. So
A grief storm.
definitely on the track there. Yep.
Yeah. So then in the aftermath of that instant, there is an emotional flood, an oversensitivity where the narrator is struggling with an emotional maelstrom. So far, so good?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'm kind of identify as well, maybe all poets do, I don't know, a highly sensitive person. So yes, oversensate. Yep.
You want to think we all are, but I'm sure that there are some exceptions around. We won't mention any. And that is all too much. The narrator can't handle it, seeks the relief of going back into the womb, where presumably everything is safe and there is no need to have to deal with such intensity. Is that a reading?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, the womb thing is interesting.
Yeah,
I like it. I hadn't thought of it that
got me
way.
back in the well.
Yeah, oh, down to there. Sorry, I just wasn't at that right spot yet. Yeah, so I kind of see the silent voice as, when you're or the silent scream. Don't you have that dream where you're screaming and no voice is coming out in the dream? Yeah. So that sense of being so overwhelmed that there's no voice. And drop me back in the well is really, well, that line is from Levertov, but it's about the well of creativity, right? That's what that means for me. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Source,
On some level, the narrator knows that there is no such retreat, that the flailing shackles have to be withstood, that time must pass whilst everything finds a new equilibrium when the canvas will snap taut. Is that what that's about?
Oh. Yeah. Just have to wait these storms out sometimes.
Yep.
And know that as chaotic as they are and terrifying as they are, that they will pass.
Yes. And in the meantime, there's nothing to do but ride out the maelstrom, the emotional buffeting, the wailing wind, because that is the shape of living. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. I got it. So I see the poem as being about grief, loss, despair, refuge, resilience, endurance, and ultimately survival. We've got to survive to keep going. Do you see it as being all of those things? And what other things might it be about?
It was really born of trying to capture the experience of one of those intense griefy moments, or maybe a depressive episode, not in an extended way, kind of the intense kind of, most of a day or half of a day kind of thing. It was born of, so this poem is actually an interesting example of when I was learning how I needed to read the Rilke material in order to access it in a generative way. So this was written in the UK, maybe I was a bit homesick or something, and I opened the selected letters, and serendipity delivered me this line from Rilke, that was: the castrato's voice intoned a requiem, wailing forth like the wind from a crack in the world. And that cracked me open, gave form. So I was already feeling very tender and sensitive, but that gave voice, opened up a channel for voice to give form to this intense experience that I was having. And some of the ship imagery was there originally, but I strengthened that as I developed the poem to make the metaphor more cohesive across the poem. Yeah. But that was one of those moments of, I think of these moments of encounter with text and the way we kind of seek them as writers. If you're a writer that writes this way, but I would suggest that perhaps if you don't think you're a writer that writes this way, you might just be doing it subconsciously and not really, just not aware that you're doing it. I call these moments kind of falling under the, actively seeking to fall under the influence. And these little bits of texts are like incantation that, you know, is like a key and unlocks something in you that allows you to give voice. You be brought to voice, actually, is a phrase from Levertov, from her Organic Form Manifesto. Yeah, so these bits of text kind of put us in the space of writing, open us up, crack us open, allow us to give voice to a particularly intense experience. So that's really what I was trying to do in this poem.
And to capture, in a way, I suppose, the mystery of the process.
Yeah, the waiting and the acceptance. Yeah, yeah. But there's that, you talked about that yearning. I can see that's here as well. So in the midst of it, I am, the speaker, you know, is kind of going, please.
Get me out of here.
Take me back to the place, take me back to the connected place, take me back to the well, you know.
Right. All right, I've got another one.
Yes, okay. Okay, so I might need to speak a little bit more about that passage that I mentioned before I went on that creatively generative walk, before I read this poem and the next one. So this poem that I'm going to read is called A Promontory, a Memory. And there's an epigraph at the beginning, which is an extract from this passage that I read on this particular day that was creatively generative for me, but then turned out to be the focus of this theory by a philosopher called Mark Rowlands. This particular kind of embodied memory that he talks about, that he calls Rilkean memory. I mean, how beautiful is that? But he calls it Rilkean memory. And the idea taken from this passage from Rilke, and I might read some of it to you, is that it's a type of memory that becomes forgotten but embodied and evident in glance and gesture. Okay. Now, which bits will I read? I might read it from the book because it's got the glance and gesture bit. So Rilke says, for verses are not, as people imagine, simply feelings. Those one has early enough. They are experiences. For the sake of a single verse, one must see many cities, men and things. One must know the animals. One must feel how the birds fly and know the gesture with which the little flowers open in the morning. One must be able to think back to roads unknown, to unexpected meetings and departings one had long seen coming, to days of childhood, and it goes on and on and on. And then he says, and yet it is still not enough to have memories. One must be able to forget them when they are many, and one must have the great patience to wait till they come again, for it is not yet the memories themselves, not till they have turned to blood within us, to glance and gesture, nameless and no longer to be distinguished from ourselves. Not till then can it happen that in a most rare hour, the first word of a verse arises in their midst and goes forth with them. So Mark Rowlands was talking about this particular kind of embodied memory, but Rilke is talking about this process of forgetting and things becoming embodied, or experiencing so much, forgetting to the point that it becomes embodied, and only then can a poem be born. So this first poem I'm going to read comes after a little extract from that passage, and engages with that idea, but also with a range of other concepts that were in the index. So it's got a lot going on. But anyway, it's also just a poem. Pink and purple pig face, tailors of the coast, salt-resistant sentries of the sea itself. Feathered faces rise, caress each arc of blustering morning, 100 tiny baskets set on a ledge to catch the light. Their gesture fills a space that walks with me, walks beside me, treads here too, a solitude like rain against the cheek of the heart, a daily bow overlooked, an unaccounted volta, spun to song of sun, played at waning moon. A motion so assured, it knows of endings and beginnings, of animals, the flight of birds, nocturnal stirrings that make a city's fringe, a long windswept ridge where emerald bauble, shallow root stitch the edge of the world. We do the work of gathering, salt water impressions pressed, time, tide, and memory against leaves of mind. Each gesture is a promise of a different quality, gifts of turquoise beads from sleeve of sea.
So, Willo, the piece that you read out from Rilke kind of reinforces my thought about the last poem, Sail, that you apprehend poetry as needing to have depth, to have layers of meaning, if you like, many cities. When you sit down to write a poem, is that something you have to really work on, or is it natural for you to write in this way?
I think maybe I feel there's something worth pursuing in a draft if I feel that it has some kind of depth. But then in drafting, in a range of different ways, probably seek to thicken things that I perceive are there. So it's probably both. Probably both, yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the subject of memory and forgetting, if you like, and then remembering. We know that memory is fallible, that a memory can change with each recounting of it. Do you see one of the functions of poetry as preserving a memory in amber so that you can return to it and revisit it, if you like, as a moment that your poetry has captured?
In the sense that a poem captures or gives form to an experience, yes. In the sense that I use poems or writing in general to figure out what I feel about things. That's a kind of solidifying, I suppose. Yes. So definitely in terms of their function in the process. Yeah. Feels a bit heavy though, doesn't it? Like preserving them in amber time. That feels a bit heavy, but I definitely can see that they're, anything like, any work of art is a kind of a snapshot in time.
Yes.
So there's always that kind of slicing of what something was in this moment. And that's a kind of preservation. Yeah.
Memory, as we know, is complex. It's not simply about the fact of a moment, but it's also about the moment's interpretation, the moment's mood, the moment's significance, the moment's emotional core.
Yeah.
Is a poem like this trying to hold the moment up to the light and capture all this complexity, do you think?
Yes, I think I'm more about the felt sense of things when I'm writing. That's what I'm more attuned to and in pursuit of a truth of. Yeah, a felt truth. I mean, there's a lot going on in this poem, but the kind of narrative is of a moment, of walking along the cliff line, promontory. And it's got a lot of other things going on in it as well, like ideas of solitude that are important to my writing, but were very important to Rilke, the gestures idea, the idea of being amongst all of that other than human life. Yeah, there's many kind of cognitive layers that have been of Levertov's that have been scaffolded into this. And the idea is that all of this stuff kind of sediments in our memory against leaves of the mind. So, you know, memory as a book. Levertov herself had this great quote where she said, all the books the poet has read are in the poet's mind. It's a really, really beautiful passage. I'm not sure I've got it with me today to share with you, but so that's a reference to that idea from her that I absolutely just loved, that we carry all of our experiences, so our situated experiences, but also our experiences via reading, as a kind of Rilkean memory with us, and that they're gifts that we're carrying around.
And they find their way into the poems.
Yeah, in a particular moment via a particular experience. Yeah.
I'm always interested in a poet's word choices. You write, their gesture fills a space that walks with me, walks beside me, treads here too. And when I read that, I was expecting something like walks within me instead of treads here too. Was that an option that you considered and discarded, or were you keen to distinguish the final line from the previous two lines?
So it'd be an oral thing for me. Things sound right for me before I know, so that's the first knowing for me. If something is orally right in a poem before I assess it intellectually. Treads here too is trying to bring it back to this specific moment, this specific place on the cliff edge. That there's always this kind of sense of solitude with me, around me. And here it is again in this specific moment, in this kind of situated experience. But it would have come to me orally first. Yeah.
I mean, I know when I ask poets questions about things like that, how can they remember what was in their mind when they wrote the poem? But I like to ask them anyway to see what comes out. As with all of your poems, there are striking lines here that made me stop and reread them, and that I would love to explore one day, but not now. Lines like "Against the cheek of the heart" and "Song of sun played at waning moon," and the one that you've already mentioned, "Against leaves of mind." I'm not going to ask you about these lines individually, but would you say something more generally about what you are trying to do with language in your poetry? You describe yourself as a lyric poet.
That's a very big question, David.
I know, we've got all day, right?
Yes, oh my goodness. Okay, it's, there's a lot that won't be conscious. Things that I am conscious of are I'm trying to embody a felt sense. So again, sound will be more important than the literal meaning or the rational meaning of a word. I'm often trying to sensuously or physically impact the reader with word choice, kind of in an embodied way. I often know that a poem is ready when the sonic shape of it is found. And sometimes they'll still be tinkering with things, but that central sonic shape will remain. Almost like I hear it like a song. And when I write, I guess I'm following sonic threads. you know, so there's alliteration and things like that going on there that I'm just following. And then the images come as I'm pursuing the sound. Yes, an amazing question, David.
You spend a lot of time. You spend a lot of time.
Yeah.
Spend a lot of time walking around the house, reading out drafts aloud.
Me? Do I walk around reading?
To get that sonic sense until you've got the right draft.
No, I tend to write in dialogue with the page. I do read things out, but I'm not necessarily someone that, you know, I know some people have like a whole poem formed in their mind before they commit it to the page. So it's much more material and physical kind of almost dance exchange or something for me with the page when I'm drafting. But I think because I have a background in music, I'm naturally always approaching things kind of primarily, you know, from that sonic position. I do read things out loud to do that, but I actually don't have to, because that's how I hear, how I relate to the poem. I think even in the way when I read a poem out loud, there's a very clear way it should sound in my mind, and I seek to kind of convey that when I kind of perform my poetry. I don't know if this is answering your question, but yeah, I'm sometimes like couplets and things will come to me, like that Bones of Poems and Dreams kind of, and I'll quickly scribble them down. So things will come to me and I'll quickly scribble them down. I won't really walk around with a whole poem in my head reciting it though, yet I will spend hours with a draft, you know, negotiating a single comma a whole day, dialoguing with the page. Yeah.
The poem ends with an Emily Dickinsonian M dash.
Oh, yeah.
Is that to signify that there is really no end to the many cities the poem and the memory contemplate, that the poem is in a sense unfinished, or did you have a different objective in mind?
Yes, I wanted to have that open sense that, you know, because the sea doesn't stop coming in and going out and undulating. And all of this non-human life, you know, goes on. And if we attune ourselves to it, the receipt of the gifts can continue. Yes. So I wanted it to have an open-ended sense at the end. Yeah.
Thank you. You got two more poems.
Yeah. So this one that I'm going to read now, this second last one, is the poem that I kind of basically fully drafted. So I just said I'm not someone that walks around with full poems in my mind, except on this day, after reading the Rilkean memory passage, where I went on this walk and all of these images were unleashed, and I was like struggling to capture them, you know, for a long period of time in my phone. And they ended up being this poem, with the exception of that Quiet Deputies material that went into another poem. But most of the images from that day ended up in this poem, and this poem describes that walk as well. So this is called The Last of This Red Hour. In the space we inhabit, one burnished afternoon, we sip a taste of silence from an autumn of silences, faithful and bright, full of images and words, like skeletons of powder hulks with crowns of mangrove hair. As the golden hour blooms, tinged with aubergine, a shiver along waterglass almost breaks our spell. Each step is incantation, a stilt, a turn, a black swan pair, paddle poetry, dreams. When the chorus warms, arpeggios for the show, of word bells and wattle birds who know the pace of poem time, who know the promise of afternoon lines, the ripple of this light. We fix to stay forever, feather our minds with baubles against a northern wall, suspend our home across a watercourse, catch forgotten lines, break the skin on the pool of ourselves every sounding afternoon. As the orchid sky flies over, we scribble birds' whispered words in a tesserae of light that knows the pace of poem time, that knows the promise of afternoon lines in the last of this red hour in this cathedral of song.
This is one of the last two poems in the book, both of which you're going to read for us. And to me, together, these two poems are quietly but determinedly celebratory and uplifting. How important was it for you to end the book with these two poems and their affirmation and celebration of life?
Very important. There's a lot of darker stuff in the book, a lot that can get a bit heavy. I really wanted the emotional arc of the poem to be, there to be kind of an emergence at the end, a sense of lightness at the end, a sense of looking forward, a sense of, looking forward to the future, etc. Yeah, it was really important, the placement of this lighter material at the end of the book. Yeah. Thanks for noticing.
No, I did. This poem places the narrator in a juxtaposition of the ethereal quality of light at dusk with the raucous conversation of birds at that time of day. Is the narrator here simply a witness and observer or something more?
Both. So, yes, being present to all of that life, and also being in the, it being a really poetic moment. So I'm in the poetry of the natural world, and and also in this space that allows, the promise of afternoon lines. So I've, the speaker has somehow accessed the pace of poem time, and lines of poetry are coming to them whilst they are in the poetry of the natural world. And so, in this cathedral of song, the poems plus the non-human nature as well.
I haven't counted how many poems refer to birds and songs, but it'd be quite a few in this book. As it does here again. The poem refers to our spell and then follows with the line, each step is incantation. I know that line isn't referring specifically to the poem, but can it not also refer to this poem, where it is like a spell, charm, enchantment, or bewitchery, a magic formula
because
intended...
I was under some kind of spell, absolutely. So the spell is in all the sounds that are happening in the natural world, but then also it refers to that idea that we've been speaking of, that, that I was under some kind of charm that was created by a fragment of language. And then if the speaker is kind of writing a poem while they're walking, they are generating some kind of new incantation with every line that they write. So there's this kind of, three senses of what an incantation could be, or perhaps that every new encounter or every moment of presence is itself acting like an incantation, because the poem keeps coming, the lines keep coming.
A couple of lines in the middle of the poem, and wattle birds who know the pace of poem time, who know the promise of afternoon lines, that are repeated at the end of the poem, in a tesserae of light that knows the pace of poem time, that knows the promise of afternoon lines. The repetition suggests to me that these lines have particular significance for you. What are you alluding to in these lines, and what was your intention in repeating them?
So my intention in repeating them is to make the poem more song-like. So it's like a chorus or a refrain or something. And to reinforce the idea of a certain way of being, a certain type of presence that is the pace of poem time that accesses poetry. Yeah, but I think formally, I'd have to go back to my draft. I'm sure I didn't write them twice. I'm sure I repeated them because I was like, oh, that's got potential as a song-like refrain. And also, you know, the rhythm of them seemed to have song-like potential for me. Don't ask me in this moment to name what the time signature is, but I was conscious of it. Yeah, so I was trying to lean into that reference there, both by the words and by the form. Yeah, I guess that's kind of saying, and I guess so that, you know, the pace of poem time and then making them more song-like is a temporal reference as well, that there's something about a certain rhythm. That's what I'm kind of trying to lean into there by doing that with those couple of lines.
Musicality of song.
Yeah. That there's a temporality to a way of being, but also obviously a poem has musicality. So there's all those dimensions of time signatures going on there that I was trying to foreground with the idea of a certain temporality, I guess.
Anything else that you wanted to say about this poem?
No, I wanted to kind of make sure I spoke about the Rilke memory thing. Yeah, and that, so that this was born of that. So I'm happy to move on to the last one.
Okay,
if you
the last
wanted
one.
To. So this poem is called Note to Self in Novel Times, and it was written at the beginning of the pandemic. There's obviously also a pun in the word novel as well. And I don't know if it's important to note, but formally there's a big division down the middle of the page with this poem of white space. Remember to love the world, love the wailing, rolling world, the air, the wildness of wind, lifting a million kites of change. Love the deep, challenging dark of water, the topography of spirit, a wheat field, a canyon, an undulating plateau, that human dream of time and space. Lean into that and this, the singular note of your human heart, calling you home.
It's funny, I just realized something that I hadn't realized before when you read the poem, where you speak of love the wailing, rolling world, and then back in your poem Sail, the world's all wailing wind. I hadn't made that connection. So
neither had I. So thank you.
There's echoes between the poems. So as you mentioned, this poem was written during the beginning of the pandemic. Why do you think it was particularly necessary for you to write these notes to self and to reiterate the need to love?
Because I guess everyone will either be this person or have this person in their circle. I was kind of the person who very early on, like as the ideas of lockdown were being proposed, I was like, you know, trying to talk to people and my family about the existential crisis that this was. What would it mean to live in a world without hugs, without touch? I was just so thinking about that, affected by that really deeply. Many of us were, I'm sure, but I needed to write about it because that was just, I don't know, perceived as being a bit intense at the time. So I needed to put it to paper. I wanted to, you know, give voice to this existential dilemma that was throwing me at the time. that, you know, everyone came to think, you know, in their own way and in their own pace eventually. But you know, with so many poems, they come from not being given space to give voice to something. So it was written really early on. Actually, going back to the material in prep for today, I did see that there was a preliminary version of this that this then drew on in those first days of the pandemic, and the form came, which kind of made it a real poem, not just a fragment of something. I don't know, it might be worth showing, but
Yeah,
you can
so
see
is that form trying to
there's a division.
reflect, yeah, the schism that, you know, happened to us all during that time?
Yeah, so that I just felt that so acutely and painfully. How could I possibly live in a world? I mean, I wasn't living alone. I was living with my partner, but how could I possibly live in a world where I couldn't hug the rest of my family again? Or, you know, what will it mean for humanity to live in a world without touch? It was huge for me. So once I found the form for this poem, you know, I actually didn't write very much during the pandemic. It was not a creatively generative time for me. It was just kind of surviving. But I wrote this one right at the beginning. And I suppose I included it in the book because it kind of spoke back to, you know, other challenges that are in the book. And then there's this kind of collective challenge that we all went through at the end. Yeah, and having that space and forcing the reader to traverse that space really kind of seemed to work for me and make the poem say something. There's the one line in it. There's only one line in the whole poem that bridges the gap, and that's of your human heart. And that was really important to me.
Nice. So you were worried during COVID that isolation would remove you from loving the world and the deep.
But humanity, that everyone's humanity was going to be altered. This was very distressing to me.
Yeah. And the deep and the wildness of wind, and that above all else, this poem was about nurturing yourself so that you didn't lose those things.
Yeah. I guess it's saying, remember your humanity. Here are ways to do it. Don't lose yourself. Don't lose, the sense of yourself as a human. If this is how we're going to live, find ways to remain connected to that human self, to that human heart. Yeah.
As always with such a poem, we've touched on this before, what's interesting is what is left out of the poem as much as what is put in it. You just mentioned, you know, this sort of almost panic, the sort of idea of not having hugs and touch. One of the things I thought might have been in the poem, given the isolation during COVID, was touch, but it's not there. I was wondering whether earlier iterations of the poem might have included things later discarded, and how you arrived at this final version of the poem. Was this a poem that was initially much longer and that you pared down to get to its essence?
So the original fragment was a bit different, but not much longer. I actually am someone that compression is my more native zone. So things
you don't need to cut and cut and cut.
I'm not the person that writes 40 pages naturally and then pairs back to the short poem. I kind of tend to dwell in the shorter end of things. Mostly what was significant to the drafting of this poem was finding that form. Yeah. And then there were other things that I wasn't conscious of happening, but that I can see in retrospect. That's something we haven't really spoken about today, how much that happens. That's how much of everything we've spoken about today is really happening subconsciously. And then like you go, oh, what have I done there? When you look at a draft, I could see only after writing it that the calling you home is probably an allusion to Mary Oliver's The Wild Geese, the honking of the geese. I wasn't really conscious of that at the time though. It does remember to love the world. does come from a line from a different poem of Oliver's. But that's, you know, that's just the way that I kind of tend to work with spin-offs and things. Yes, it was really about finding the form, and then I felt that I had a poem. Yeah, that I'd given voice to that experience of that moment there. Yeah.
Okay. I think we've sort of gone into some depth on the theme of process, provenance, and influence. Was there anything else that you wanted to say about that theme?
No, this has been amazing. I was so nervous that I would, you know, be tongue-tied and not be able to remember things, because there was a lot to remember from this kind of research work that I did. But this has been really lovely. I've had a really good time.
My invisible presence.
I feel like I've covered most things. Is there anything that, like I said, that is left to, you know, that's kind of tangled, or that should be?
No, I think people just need to go out and buy the book and read it. That's what I think.
Here it is. Here it is. Here it is.
A wonderful book, and congratulations on it. Thank you so much, Willo, for sharing your poems and exploring your experiences in depth, thoughts and insights on the theme of process, provenance, and influence. It's been wonderful. Details of Willo's gorgeous first book and where to get it will be posted with this podcast, so please look out for them. Next up on Poets Corner, all the way from North Carolina, will be Kevin Hart on the theme of desire. See you then.